He wasn't supposed to be home that day. The flight got canceled, a routine delay that felt like an inconvenience at the time, nothing more than a disruption to a tightly scheduled week. So he came back early, thinking only about the quiet comfort of his house, the familiar scent of polished wood and clean linen, the soft voice of his pregnant wife greeting him at the door. He walked into his house expecting silence, the kind of stillness that settles over a home in the middle of the afternoon. But instead, he heard screaming, sharp and panicked, the kind of sound that doesn't belong in a place that once felt safe. And when he rushed upstairs, heart pounding, breath caught somewhere between fear and disbelief, he saw something no husband and no son should ever see, something that would fracture every memory he thought he understood about his family. His own mother, the woman who had raised him through hardship, who had taught him right from wrong, standing over his pregnant wife, her hands clenched, her voice raised, her anger spilling over in a way he had never witnessed before. His wife, Jennifer, was on the floor, one hand protecting her stomach, her face pale, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and betrayal that cut deeper than any words ever could. In that moment, time seemed to stretch, every second dragging with unbearable weight as he stood there, frozen between two lives, two loyalties, two versions of the truth he had believed in for so long. What happened next would tear his family apart forever, because in that moment he had to make a choice, not tomorrow, not after thinking it through, but right then, standing in that doorway, between the woman who had raised him, Linda, and the woman carrying his child. And the decision he made shocked everyone who knew him, because it revealed something no one had ever truly seen before, not even him. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This wasn't just a family argument, not the kind that fades after raised voices and slammed doors, not the kind people laugh about later over dinner as if nothing ever happened. What unfolded inside that house had been building quietly for months, layer by layer, hidden beneath polite smiles, short conversations, and carefully controlled silence. To anyone looking from the outside, Daniel's life seemed stable, even admirable, a man who had worked hard, married a kind woman, and was preparing to become a father. But inside those walls, something had shifted long before that afternoon, something that Jennifer had tried to live with, something she had tried to explain in ways Daniel never fully understood. Linda had never raised her voice like that before, not in front of him, not in a way that crossed the line from strict to something far more personal, far more hurtful. And yet Jennifer's reaction suggested this wasn't new, that the fear in her eyes came from more than just that single moment. So what really led to that scene? To a mother standing over her son's pregnant wife with anger she could no longer hide. And why had it reached that point without Daniel seeing it sooner? Why did Linda seem to carry a quiet resentment toward Jennifer from the very beginning? One that grew stronger as the months passed, turning small disagreements into something heavier, something harder to ignore? And more importantly, what happened in the seconds after Daniel stepped into that room? What choice did he make when everything he believed about loyalty and family was put to the test? A decision that would not only define his future, but also reveal a truth no one in that family was prepared to face. What caused the attack? Who had been hiding the truth all along? And when it came down to it, did Daniel make the right choice? Or was there a cost to that decision that no one could ever undo? Daniel built his life from nothing, and that wasn't just something people said about him. It was something he carried in the way he spoke, the way he worked, and the way he viewed responsibility. He had grown up watching his mother, Linda, work long hours, often coming home exhausted, but still finding the strength to make sure he had what he needed, even when it meant she went without. There were years when money was tight, when choices were limited, and when the future felt uncertain, but Linda never allowed him to see fear, only determination. That shaped Daniel into the kind of man who believed that hard work could fix almost anything, that loyalty wasn't optional, and that family came before everything else. By the time he built his career and created a stable life, he didn't just see it as success, he saw it as a promise fulfilled, a way of honoring everything his mother had sacrificed. And because of that, his bond with Linda wasn't just close, it was unshakable, or at least that's what he had always believed. Jennifer came into his life at a time when everything else felt structured and predictable, and in many ways, she was the opposite of that structure. She was warm in a way that didn't demand attention, kind in a way that felt natural rather than forced, and emotionally aware in ways Daniel had never needed to be before. She listened more than she spoke, noticed the things others ignored, and had a way of bringing calm into situations that would normally create tension. When they married, it didn't feel like a dramatic change. It felt like something that fit, something that made sense in a quiet, steady way. And when they found out she was pregnant, that sense of completeness only grew stronger, as if everything Daniel had worked toward was finally coming together. Jennifer embraced that future with a softness that showed in everything she did, from the way she prepared the house to the way she spoke about the baby. But beneath that calm, there were moments, small at first, where something seemed to weigh on her, something she never fully explained. Linda, on the other hand, had always been a force in Daniel's life, someone who believed in discipline, order, and knowing exactly where people stood. She didn't trust easily, and she didn't accept change without questioning it, especially when it involved her son. To her, Daniel wasn't just her child. He was the result of years of sacrifice, and she carried a quiet belief that no one could understand him the way she did. When Jennifer entered the picture, Linda was polite, even welcoming on the surface, but there was a distance in her tone, a hesitation in her approval that never fully went away. She didn't express it openly, not in ways that could be easily pointed out, but it showed in subtle ways, in the comments that sounded harmless but carried weight, in the questions that felt more like judgments, and in the way she watched Jennifer, as if measuring her against a standard no one had ever explained. In Linda's eyes, no woman would ever be good enough for her son, not because Jennifer lacked anything obvious, but because Linda had already decided what Daniel deserved long before Jennifer arrived. At first, it was small things, the kind of moments that could be dismissed if no one looked too closely. A comment about how things were done differently before, a suggestion that sounded helpful but felt critical, a look that lingered just a second too long. During visits, there was a tension that couldn't quite be named, something that sat quietly in the room even when conversations continued as normal. Daniel didn't notice it, not in a way that concerned him, because nothing was ever direct enough to demand attention. But Jennifer noticed, even if she didn't say much about it, and over time, that silence began to change her. She became quieter, more careful with her words, more aware of how she moved and what she said whenever Linda was around. What started as something easy to ignore slowly grew into something harder to explain, and even harder to stop, until it became clear that this wasn't just discomfort anymore. It was something else entirely, something that had been building long before Daniel ever walked through that door on that afternoon. She never said anything directly, not in a way that could be repeated word for word, not in a way that would make Daniel stop and question everything. But she didn't have to, because the weight of it was always there, hidden in tone, in timing, in the way conversations would shift the moment Jennifer entered the room. You could feel it every time they were in the same space, a quiet tension that sat between them, growing stronger with each visit, with each passing week. Daniel noticed that Jennifer had become more reserved, but he explained it away the same way he explained everything else, as stress, as hormones, as the natural pressure that comes with preparing for a child. He told himself it would pass, that things would settle, that his mother would eventually warm up, because that's what he believed about family. That time fixed what people couldn't. But Jennifer wasn't just adjusting. She was changing, and the difference was subtle enough to ignore, at least for someone who wasn't looking closely. At first, she stopped sharing small details about her day, the kind of things she used to mention without thinking, little moments that once filled the quiet spaces between them. Then she began avoiding certain conversations altogether, especially when they involved Linda, offering short answers instead of explanations, brushing things off with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Daniel would ask if something was wrong, and she would always say no, always find a way to reassure him, because saying more would mean creating a conflict he wasn't ready to face. And every time she chose silence, it allowed something else to grow, something that neither of them fully acknowledged. But what Daniel didn't realize was that while he was away, while he was focused on work and responsibilities outside the home, the situation inside was becoming harder for Jennifer to manage, harder to ignore, and much harder to control. Linda had started visiting more often, sometimes announced, sometimes not, arriving with the same calm presence she always carried, but staying longer than before, watching more closely than before. The conversations during those visits became shorter, more pointed, filled with questions that sounded simple but carried an underlying pressure that Jennifer could no longer pretend not to notice. There were moments when Linda would correct her, not openly, but in ways that made it clear she didn't approve, moments when her voice would harden just slightly, enough to shift the atmosphere in the room. And each time it happened, Jennifer would adjust, step back, try to keep the peace, because she believed that was the right thing to do, especially now, especially with a child on the way. But keeping the peace came at a cost, and that cost began to show in ways that Daniel still didn't fully understand. Then one day, something changed in a way that couldn't be explained away so easily. The housekeeper, who had been with the family long enough to notice the difference between routine and disruption, saw something that didn't sit right. It wasn't just the silence in the house. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, the kind that suggests something has already happened and hasn't been spoken about. She noticed the way Jennifer moved, slower, more careful, as if every step required thought, and the way she avoided certain areas of the house, choosing to stay where she felt most visible. When she asked if everything was all right, Jennifer smiled the same way she always did, but this time there was something missing, something that made the answer feel incomplete. Because the truth was, Jennifer wasn't just quiet anymore. She wasn't just adjusting or overwhelmed. She was afraid, and that fear had been building long before anyone decided to pay attention to it. That afternoon, everything changed in a way none of them could take back. Not with apologies, not with explanations, not even with time. Daniel wasn't supposed to be home. His schedule had been set for days, meetings lined up, travel arranged, every hour accounted for the way he liked it. But plans shifted, the flight was canceled, and what should have been a minor inconvenience became something far more significant, though he didn't know that yet. He drove back expecting the same quiet routine, the same predictable calm that had defined his home for months, telling himself he might surprise Jennifer, maybe even make her smile after the distance he had started to notice but never fully addressed. When he stepped inside, the house didn't feel the same, not in a way he could immediately explain, but in a way that made him pause for just a second longer than usual, as if something in the air had changed. At first, it was just a faint sound, something distant and unclear, easy to dismiss if he hadn't been paying attention. But then it came again, louder this time, sharper, and impossible to ignore. He heard yelling, not the kind of raised voices that come and go, but something strained, something filled with emotion that had been held back for too long. Then came crying, uneven and desperate, the kind that doesn't stop on its own, the kind that makes you move before you even think. And then there was a voice he recognized instantly, one that stopped him in place for the briefest moment before everything else took over. It was Linda, but not the version of her he had always known, not calm, not controlled, but something else entirely, something he had never heard before. His body reacted before his mind could catch up, his steps quickening as he moved through the house, each second stretching longer than it should, each sound pulling him closer to something he wasn't prepared to face. The closer he got, the clearer it became that this wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't something that would resolve itself with a conversation. This was something already in motion, something already out of control. He reached the stairs and took them faster than he ever had, his thoughts racing but never quite forming into anything complete, because part of him didn't want to believe what he was about to see. The sound of something falling echoed through the hallway, followed by a silence that felt heavier than the noise itself, a silence that made everything feel suspended, as if the house was holding its breath. When he reached the door, he didn't hesitate, he didn't knock, he didn't call out. He pushed it open with a force that matched everything building inside him. And in that instant, everything he thought he understood about his life shifted. He froze, not because he didn't want to move, but because his mind needed a moment to process what his eyes were seeing, a moment that felt far longer than it actually was. Jennifer was on the floor, one arm wrapped protectively around her stomach, her face pale, her breathing uneven, her eyes wide with a fear that went beyond the moment itself, as if it had been there long before he arrived. And Linda was standing over her, her posture rigid, her expression tight, her presence filling the space in a way that made it clear this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a single moment gone too far. This was something that had already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Daniel's heart pounded in a way he had never felt before, not just from shock, but from the realization that he was standing between two realities he could no longer keep separate. The woman who had raised him, who had sacrificed everything to give him a chance at the life he now lived, and the woman he had chosen to build that life with, who was now carrying his child, both in the same room, both connected to him in ways that made what he was seeing almost impossible to accept. For a brief second, no one spoke, no one moved, as if they were all waiting for something to break the moment, something to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no explanation that could come fast enough, no words that could undo what he had already seen. And in that silence, with everything hanging in the balance, Daniel made a decision, one that didn't come from hesitation, one that didn't come from confusion, but from something deeper, something that would define everything that came after. But what he did next, in that moment when everything could have gone a different way, was something no one expected, not Jennifer, not Linda, and not even Daniel himself. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. It was just the first time Daniel saw it with his own eyes, the first time the reality inside his home could no longer be explained away or softened by assumptions. In the hours that followed, as the shock began to settle into something heavier and more difficult to ignore, the situation started to unfold in ways Daniel had never taken the time to examine before. What had seemed like isolated moments, small misunderstandings, or differences in personality began to connect, forming a pattern that had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. Jennifer didn't say everything at once, not because she was unwilling, but because putting it into words meant reliving moments she had tried to move past, moments she had convinced herself were temporary, manageable, or simply part of adjusting to a new family dynamic. But now, with everything exposed, the silence that once protected that version of reality no longer served a purpose. The housekeeper, who had quietly observed the household for months without interfering, became an unexpected source of clarity. She had noticed the changes long before Daniel did. The way Jennifer's movements became more cautious, the way her voice softened around Linda, the way certain conversations ended the moment Linda entered the room. At the time, it didn't seem like her place to question it. But now, with the situation laid bare, her observations filled in the gaps Daniel hadn't realized existed. There were days when Linda would arrive unannounced, staying for hours, creating an environment where Jennifer felt watched rather than welcomed. There were moments when Linda's words carried a sharpness that wasn't immediately obvious, comments that questioned Jennifer's decisions, her habits, even her readiness to become a mother, all framed in a way that made them difficult to challenge without creating conflict. And over time, those moments added up, shaping an atmosphere where Jennifer felt increasingly isolated, even within her own home. What Daniel began to understand was that this wasn't about a single outburst or a moment of lost control. It was the result of a pattern that had been developing steadily, one that relied less on obvious confrontation and more on subtle pressure. Linda never needed to raise her voice to make her presence felt. She had a way of asserting control through tone, through timing, through the unspoken expectation that her perspective carried more weight. Jennifer, trying to maintain peace and avoid placing Daniel in a difficult position, adapted to that pressure in ways that slowly limited her own voice. She began second-guessing her choices, avoiding situations that might lead to disagreement, and ultimately withdrawing from the very space that was supposed to feel like her home. The more she adjusted, the more room it created for that dynamic to continue, reinforcing a cycle that became harder to break with each passing week. Daniel's role in all of this was harder for him to face, not because he had caused it directly, but because he had missed it, or perhaps chosen not to see it clearly enough when the signs first appeared. His belief in keeping the peace, in assuming that things would resolve themselves over time, had allowed the situation to develop without intervention. He had trusted that both women in his life would find a way to coexist, without fully recognizing the imbalance that had already taken hold. And now, looking back, the signs were there in ways that felt impossible to ignore: the quiet shifts in Jennifer's behavior, the subtle changes in Linda's tone, the growing distance that had slowly replaced what once felt like stability. What had happened that afternoon was not an isolated event. It was the breaking point of something that had been building for far longer than Daniel had ever realized, a moment that forced everything into the open, leaving no room for misunderstanding, and no easy way to move forward without confronting the truth. In that moment, as everything settled into a silence that felt heavier than the chaos before it, Daniel made a decision, not slowly, not after weighing every possible outcome, but with a clarity that came from understanding what was at stake. It wasn't the kind of choice he had ever imagined having to make, not between two people who had defined so much of his life, but the reality in front of him left no space for hesitation. He wasn't standing there as a son anymore, bound by years of loyalty and gratitude. He was standing there as a husband and a father, faced with the responsibility of protecting something that depended entirely on him. The weight of that realization cut through everything else, through confusion, through disbelief, through the instinct to preserve what had always been familiar. He reached for his phone, his hands steady in a way that surprised even him, and without raising his voice, without looking away from the scene in front of him, he made the call that would change everything. Linda didn't expect it, not in that moment, not from him, because in her mind, the bond they shared had always been stronger than anything that could come between them. There was a shift in her expression as she realized what he was doing, a moment where the certainty she carried began to break, replaced by something she had never had to face before from her own son. Jennifer, still on the floor, still trying to process everything that had just happened, looked at him with a mixture of relief and disbelief, as if she had prepared herself for a different outcome, one where her voice would once again be overshadowed by something she couldn't control. But Daniel didn't waver, not this time, because the decision he made in that moment wasn't about choosing one person over another. It was about drawing a line that should have never been crossed. He chose to protect his wife, not with words or promises, but with an action that made it clear where he stood, no matter the cost, no matter what it meant for the relationship he once believed could never be broken. But the truth is, some choices don't just change your life. They redraw the lines of everything you thought would always remain the same, and in Daniel's case, that meant accepting a reality he had never prepared for. The consequences of that moment didn't end when the call was made or when the immediate danger passed. They carried forward into every conversation that followed, every silence that replaced what once felt familiar. Linda was no longer just his mother in the way he had always known her, because something had been broken that couldn't be repaired by time or explanation. And for the first time, Daniel had to see her not only through the lens of his past, but through the impact of her actions in the present. Jennifer, on the other hand, began to find her voice again, slowly, carefully, as if rebuilding something that had been taken from her piece by piece. And while the road ahead was far from simple, there was a shift in the way she looked at Daniel, a recognition of the choice he had made when it mattered most. What remained between them was not just relief, but the understanding that protecting a family sometimes means redefining it, even when that comes with a cost that never fully disappears. Because some decisions don't come with clean endings, they come with distance, with absence, with the quiet acceptance that certain relationships cannot continue in the same way after a line has been crossed. Daniel carried that with him, the weight of what he had done and what it meant, not as regret, but as a reminder that doing what is right doesn't always feel right in the moment, especially when it forces you to confront truths about the people you love. And as time moved forward, the life he had with Jennifer and the child they were preparing to welcome became his focus, shaped not just by what they had endured, but by what they had chosen to protect. So if you were in his position, standing in that doorway, faced with a moment that demanded more than words, what would you have done? Would you have stood by your mother, holding on to the past and everything it represented, or would you have protected your family, even if it meant letting go of something you once believed could never be lost? Please don't forget to hit that subscribe button, likes, share, and drop your comment. Your support allows us to keep telling those important stories.